We're so excited to have my friend, the co-director of the film, with us on the W, Ben Proudfoot. Hey, Ben.
Hello, John. How are you?
I'm doing great. It's great to see you. I am so excited to talk about this film, A Concerto's a Conversation. You know, at Windrider, conversation is a big part of our ethos. And so even beyond Horace asking Chris, what is a concerto, and Chris telling him, it feels to me that there's a lot more conversation taking place. And so I'm just curious, is the title of the film only about the description of a concerto? Because it feels to me like there's metaphors that are multi-layered going beyond that.
You know, I'm always looking for a layered title. There's not only a literal conversation between two people, but there's also a conversation. Chris's life and his grandfather's life are inextricable in that decision. You know, the elder affects the younger and vice versa. And I think, you know, that core question that Chris poses, which is, you know, do I belong in this space, right? I'm overcome with this imposter syndrome as a black composer in a classically white space, is answered by his grandfather's story. Chris's story is answered by his grandfather's story. And I think that's another kind of conversation.
Well, and what I really appreciated about the film, especially in these times that we live where there's so much conversation around racial issues, that you invited us into a storyline that allowed us to have an intimate understanding of what at least this one family, multi-generational, has gone through.
Yeah, I mean, I think, at least what I take from that story was that, you know, he traveled thousands of miles all across the country to get to, you know, the so-called, promised land of Los Angeles, and it was the same damn thing, just in a different suit, you know? It is not a story of somebody who was in a racist community and left and found nirvana in California. He met the same problems. I think the thing that always astounds me when I hear stories from someone like Horace, who's 91 years old, is that, you know, this is seems like it should be history book material, but it's living history. I mean, that is Horace's memory of his life. This is not something, you know, that happened so long ago that everybody who remembers it is dead. It's happening now, it happened then, and those stories are there to be shared.
And Chris's question to his grandfather, am I supposed to be here? It so struck me because Horace's answer is both emphatic, but sort of gentle. And then Chris's just response, the way you caught that response without words. Talk about that moment for a second.
Horace's response of, you know, you wouldn't be there if you weren't supposed to be there, right? That's the reason why we need to hear his story, his experience. And that moment for me is just like a beautiful moment of Chris's openness of listening. You know, in as much as there is a lot of learning and material in the film about the experience of being a black man in America, there's also a really important story about intergenerational conversation. I have heard so many times people say, I've really been meaning to interview my dad or interview my mom, right? We know that it's a good idea, but we don't do it, like so many things in our lives. So to me, that's been the most satisfying outcome of Concerto, is that I think it inspired people to go and have those conversations. My dad passed away a year ago, and one of the things he always said to me was, you know, your mother and I have over a century of experience on the planet. And if you discard that, you're throwing away one of your most valuable resources. And I think as young people, it's a huge power trip to ignore your parents, right? And do your own thing. It's really exciting. You're free, you get to make your own decisions, etc. But when it really comes down to it, you don't have to take every piece of advice from your parents and grandparents, but we'd be fools not to hear them out. And I think too often we ignore and cast aside and sort of belittle the experience of our elders when really we need to study those experiences. And my hope with Concerto is that will spark more conversations like that.
So many themes get packed into that intergenerational story. And in the case of Concerto, I was just so taken by this entrepreneurial nature of Horace. I'm just curious if you and Chris talked at all about Horace's grit and how that might have informed Chris's own risk-taking.
I really related to him when he was talking to his grandfather, because Chris had questions for him like, did you ever doubt yourself? You know, like, were you ever wondering about whether you could do it or whether you had what it takes? And Horace was like, nope. Nope, never doubted myself. He said something like, everybody else is doubting you. Why would you doubt yourself? I think we were sort of in awe, and you see that in the film, of Horace's grit and ingenuity, and there's no leaks in his confidence, or at least doesn't seem like it. He's just a total commitment to himself and his family. I find that incredibly inspiring and also just curious, because I feel like, at least for me, like my boat of self-confidence is always springing a leak somewhere, something about Horace, he just tight as a drum, and whether or not that is just from years of being forced to have that kind of 100% conviction, or whether that's something special about him, I don't know, but has always been fascinating to me, and I know Chris and I have talked about that a lot.
I love the fact that you're taking us behind the scenes, because that's what's in essence happening at Windrider, at least the hope, is that we're able to really go beyond just what we're able to see, as beautiful as it is, because you can't contain a lifetime in 13 minutes. In going back to the intergenerational story, I just want to talk about the jacket for a minute. It really hit me in a deep way, where first it's Horace pressing this jacket at the beginning of the film and the pedals, and then it ends with Horace taking and serving his grandson by taking that jacket off of the rack, handing it to his grandson so that he could look just right for the performance. What was the germination of the jacket?
As a filmmaker, you're kind of always looking for symbols, right? Visual metaphors. And, you have this story of Chris's grandfather making sacrifices in order so that Chris can have the life that he has. And this jacket sort of became that idea, we're going to make you look good. He's talking about the jacket, but, you can connect that to the story of Horace making Chris look good, or Horace building the foundation for Chris to springboard off of in doing what he wants to do. The symbol of the suit began to collect the meaning of the torch that we pass to our children and grandchildren. As Chris sort of dons the jacket at the end, it's a gift from his grandfather almost. I knew at that moment, if we can build this movie right, this actually will be the emotional climax, is the handoff of that suit. That was always the direction in the edit, was how do we end it there? If we can end it there, we'll have told the right version of the story.
Well, on the topic of endings, the film ends with the hymn. The big question is, Ben, did you add that in just for the Windrider audience?
Absolutely, yes. All kidding aside, it was a spontaneous moment. Obviously, Chris's grandfather is a very spiritual man, and it's organic to who he is. And there was actually a funny lead up to that moment, because Chris was playing on the piano, and Chris's grandfather said, "Do you want me to sing?" And I said, yeah, I do. Chris asked him, what do you want to do? He said, a spiritual. He said, but Chris doesn't know any spirituals. Chris was like, try me, like, suggest something. And so he said, how great thou art. And that's when we rolled camera, and Chris was able to accompany a beautiful rendition of that hymn. And that's why at the end, Chris's grandfather is saying, you did it. And Chris is saying, oh, I surprised you. because that was what preceded that, was Chris's grandfather said, oh, Chris doesn't know any spirituals. And so it was just a beautiful moment. And actually Chris took a lot of the themes and tonality and, the chord progressions from How Great Thou Art and worked it into various sections of the score for the film, particularly like the family moments, to sort of bring it all together from a musical perspective. So I thought it was a beautiful way to end the film from Chris's grandfather's perspective, how he sees the story, right, which is through the eyes of God.
That's just so beautiful. Chris, knowing enough about his own grandfather to be able to include that beautiful part of his life in a subtle way that unless we heard it from you, we wouldn't know that. So Ben, recently a kind of a cool thing happened. The film was nominated for an Academy Award. You were there with Chris Bowers, and tell us a bit about just the experience, the run up to the Oscars, being there. Not everybody gets to do that. What was it like?
Oh, well, it's fascinating because we just wanted to make a nice dedication to Chris's grandfather, and that it could premiere on the New York Times was a thrill. To somehow, clinch this nomination this year, which has been a very dark year for everybody, was just so beyond, and we say this a lot, but whatever spirit was guiding Horace safely across the country took hold of this film. Because as you know, I've made a lot of short documentaries, but this had a life of its own. And Anthony and Elise, who won the Oscar in our category, I thought gave a beautiful speech and named Horace in their speech. And to me, that was way more than enough. It was a beautiful ending to that experience. And Chris and I were just like thrilled to be there. I have a lot of pictures of my feet because I couldn't believe that I was walking on the red carpet, and there it was, the red carpet, especially after a year of going to 0 social events whatsoever. For that to be our first outing was pretty special. Something I'll never forget.
As you know, Ben, we have a lot of young, emerging, aspiring filmmakers. Can you talk a little bit about the innovative process of how you shot the film?
I think probably the only thing that edges on innovation would just be the double interrotron technique. Why I like it is because it was not just technique for technique's sake. Let's try something new because nobody's done it before. It really was born of the story. It was born of the idea of a conversation. And the technique emerged to support that idea of, what is the most conversational style we can shoot this? And this direct eye line, center frame, cross-cutting of Chris and his grandfather just seemed to me the most immersive way to do that. We work hard because we don't want to screw up a beautiful thing, less that there's some beautiful thing in my head that I'm trying to get out, which is how a lot of filmmakers talk about filmmaking. It's more so doing service to what is already there.
Well, Ben, what a gift this film is, which is really a love letter from a grandson to a grandfather, and both ways actually, transcends generations, opens up just a way for all of us to hear that story and be inspired to maybe lean into the stories of our lives. Thank you for joining us on The W.
I really appreciate it, and looking forward to see you all in person next time.